Now, unfortunately, we don't have enough yearling EPDs. We've got lots of weaning EPDs, but that's easy. And we know our cattle are good at this. But that real value would be in yearling EPDs. The thing that's neat about ultrasound, if you start doing ultrasound for hitting ribeye areas, you got a yearling weight, because you're basically the same weight for that calf. And so hopefully we'll start getting more of those. Again, the other thing we always overlook is crossbreeding. You can make a huge change in cattle in a short period of time just by introducing other genetics. Now that's not an option for you as a seed stock breeder. What I'm telling you is to be realistic about selling your bulls. Don't just think about selling them to somebody who's going to put them on a Beefmaster calf. Think about crossbreeding and how you could take the assets your animal has and work with the assets that somebody else has. That's really what we're doing with the E6 program. Maybe our asset is the maternal side and somebody wants to put a bull on our cows. But that's where you can really change things quick with crossbreeding. This is another sheet that illustrates the differences in weight. This is a comparison of Nolan Ryan cattle at Sam King, and there are 2 years of data on here versus the national average. And again, it's funny, I think a lot of times that our cattle are really big. Our cattle are not really big. And I think that's maybe what I would quantify what Dr. Sanders is telling you. Yeah, you take a 7-year-old Beefmaster cow that's been in South Texas, she's going to be a big old cow. But you take that same cow and you put her in a little harder environment, maybe, I say South Texas when it rains, but you put her in a place where she doesn't grow up in that kind of nutrition, Oklahoma, for example, she's about a 1,200-pound cow. A little bit on the upper end of what he's telling you. Our cattle are not big. In fact, when we changed from Sam Cane to Swift and added the Swift population, we started getting a lot of complaints from market managers in the stores, and it's so funny to me because everybody told us, "Oh, you're gonna have so much better cattle than the Panhandle." That's what that's the perception the industry has. You're getting better cattle than the Panhandle. But when we changed, we started getting complaints, and the reason was because the ribeyes were so big, and the short ones were so big. You know, they're telling the consumer, and just like Patrick told you, the consumer doesn't want a ribeye that's that thick. They want to be able to cut one that's about that thick and still weighs, 8, 12, 15 ounces. So they actually like our size cattle better. The problem is what I told you earlier, is everybody gets paid on pounds. So until we change that, big is important. I think the message of this sheet is physiologically and genotypically speaking, our cattle are not big. So we don't probably have to worry as much about growth rate and selecting for high EPDs, I think, as maybe a breeder of Simmental or Angus. The typical Angus animal today is bigger than the typical Beefmaster animal today. That's how much they've changed those cattle. Okay? So we don't, personally, I don't think, have, at least, again, what I'm observing in our population, we don't have a size problem. We could use more muscle, and we could use better yield grades, and better dressing percentages. And now let's talk a little bit about tenderness, because that's really what I think we also have a huge opportunity in. This chart, as you can see, it shows you how the population of cattle breaks down when you evaluate it from the odds of an unpleasant eating experience. Okay? If all you evaluate cattle for is quality grade, which is what a lot of the industry has been doing, fine quality cattle, yeah, you're only going to get 3% of the time you're going to have a bad eating experience. Upper 2/3 choice, 10% of the time. Okay? If you got lower 1/3 choice, 16% of the time, select 27% of the time. So basically, in low choice or select, which is where 83% of the cattle fall, 1 out of 5 is going to eat bad. Now that's not a very good statistic. And see, most of those cattle are black. That's the part that they don't tell you. Only 18, now 17% of the Angus cattle or black hide cattle that go through the CAD program actually make this spec. All the rest of them fall down here. And 1 in 5 of them don't eat good. So there's a lot of holes in that program that current changing economic conditions are probably going to help us attack. What makes beef tender? Genetics is important, but not hide color. Just because that animal's got a 51% black hide does not make it tender. Okay? There are cattle within every population that are tender and that are tough. There's lots of beef masters that compete with any prime animal anywhere as far as tenderness. Then there are beef masters that can't. Okay? That's the key thing to understand. Quality grade is important, but only from this perspective. You do have to have enough fat in there to overcome bad cooking. And that's why choice is important to restaurants. Because they pay a cook $10 an hour, half the time he doesn't show up, and the only chance they got that guy that just came in this morning who was, fixing tires yesterday, is that stuff's so fat he can't screw it up. And that's really true. That's why the upper crust, like tablecloth restaurant, who pays their cook a lot more, has a lot less issues. But the place where you and I eat, hey, they might not, trust me, I've been there, I've seen it. That guy might have been fixing tires yesterday. I mean, they just can't keep anybody, especially with immigration cracking down. So, that's the only reason you need fat. But you only need a certain amount, and the research is pretty clear that once you get into the select grade, you probably got enough, unless that guy's really bad. And there are some of them that are really bad. Environmental factors, feed, nutrition, handling, but stress is the biggest thing that affects tenderness. You remember the guy who told you that only ultrasounds from 3 till 9 in the morning? That, we've actually seen that because stress changes meat color. And so, tender cattle have a different color than tough cattle. And that's actually what we're measuring. Cattle that don't get stressed don't do that. Cattle that get stressed do. So things like hot shots and handling and chute design and trucking that 10 years ago the industry didn't even know were important are huge now. And that's one reason anybody who hasn't learned that needs to. If you're still working with cattle with dogs and hot shots and all those things we used to love to do, I used to love to do, you need to stop. Because you're making your products taste better. Okay? It's just as simple as that. And then, there are post-kill treatments, electrical stimulation using the meat that we do. We, of course, use the beef cam, and that's really what it does. It measures color. So every animal that comes through there, we're taking a color measurement and predicting tenderness. The problem with it is it's very accurate on one side of the equation. When it says a product is tender, it's pretty tender. But about half the time when it says it's tough, it's not. Okay? So it can't be used to measure value in cattle, which is what Patrick was saying. You can't use it for EPDs or any of those kind of things. It's not that accurate. The industry is still working to get there. We actually have developed some new technology that we're about to start using that uses infrared light instead of just visible light to reflect off that muscle, measure the density of those muscle fibers, and get a more accurate prediction. This has an accuracy of about 0.4, or repeatability about an R-squared, they call it 0.4. There's newer technology that we're working on that has 2 of these cameras, and it's up to 0.9. What that means is that's a complicated research call, but we're not very far away from having a way to measure tenderness at chain speed in a plant and be accurate. Okay? And that's really good news for you guys. Let's think about an ideal selection system for a minute. I just am amazed the more I learned in my life how smart what Tom Lasser designed was. Because really, we talk about fertility. Well, that's calving, interval, early puberty, scroll measurement, libido. Those are all things you can measure as a producer. And there's nothing that impacts profitability quicker than fertility. Okay? That's the number one thing. Milking ability, we talked about that today. That's basically how heavy you can get the calf and still get the cow growth back. Pretty simple. That's probably the simplest of all the 6 cents. But here is where I used to think, I used to look at hardness and say, well, what does that mean? We can't measure hardness. Man, turns out that's the most important one. That's what you're talking about, feed efficiency, fleshing ability. Okay? Marbling is a function of hardness. If an animal doesn't have enough to eat and can't take care of itself, it is not going to develop any marbling. Okay? So an animal that's better at that than another can have more marbling. All of those things, heat tolerance is a big issue. Weight is still the biggest factor in revenue. Remember it that way. Confirmation, ribeye area, gill grade, muscling, those are all things we were talking about that Tom Lasser was talking about a long time ago. And then lo and behold, disposition, come to find out, that's probably the biggest single factor